Welcome to the Unique Bilingual State Podcast, a podcast recorded by Defining Moments Canada in the context of the Unique Bilingual State Project, which explores 250 years of institutional French-English bilingualism in all of its evolving complexity, from the Quebec Act to the present day, within the broader context of language use in Canada. Each English language episode is hosted by Anna Goldsworthy, Director of Programming and Curation at Defining Moments Canada, and features conversations with Serge Dupuis, a Franco-Ontarian historian, author of 3 books and over 30 articles that mostly deal with Francophone communities in Canada. In this 4th episode, Anna and Serge discuss the duality in New Brunswick.
Hello, Serge, and thank you for joining me this afternoon as we continue to talk about the history of bilingualism in Canada. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in on this Defining Moments Canada podcast as part of the Heritage Project, A Unique Bilingual State, 250 Years of Bilingualism in Canada. Today's topic hits very close to my heart, and that is New Brunswick. I have close family ties to New Brunswick, and perhaps I am biased, but I find their history can oftentimes be overlooked despite how rich and lengthy it is in the greater story of Canada's history. So I'm really excited to delve into this topic today. And to begin, Serge, why don't you walk us through what it is about New Brunswick that led to it becoming, as many Canadians know, Canada's only official, in air quotes, bilingual province?
That's right. It was originally inhabited by the Mi'kmaq, and at the time of New France and Acadia, Acadians set up mostly in what's now Nova Scotia, in the Annapolis Valley, and Louisbourg on Cape Breton. And then that part of French territory was ceded to Great Britain by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. So it was already a British colony by the time that the Acadian deportation began in 1755, which was an act of war during the 7 Years' War that had begun the previous year. So we often hear about Acadians being deported to Louisiana and sometimes to New England, France, and Great Britain. But what we don't talk often or as often about are the fact that some Acadians fled north to the St. John's River and to the St. Lawrence Gulf Coast. And a lot of Acadians settled in what's Quebec's Gaspésie and the North Shore, Western Prince Edward Island, and the eastern shore of New Brunswick. So in the region of Miramichi, a colony was set up at the Camp d'Espérance in 1756. And when the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, Acadians were allowed to return, but a lot of their agricultural farmland had been taken by British and American settlers, which meant that they could not go back to their homeland in Nova Scotia and therefore had to migrate elsewhere. So Acadians cleared land, for example, in the Memramcook area, which is the valley between Moncton and the Bay of Fundy. They began settling there, but a lot abandoned farming, especially those who settled on the shores of the St. Lawrence, where farmland was less profitable. So they turned to fishing. But these communities tend to be quite poor. The rate of illiteracy just kind of exploded, and it probably took them a century or a century and a half to find the type of prosperity that they had in Nova Scotia, let's say up until the 1750s. So New Brunswick actually became a province or a British colony first in 1784. With the arrival of about 30,000 loyalists from the United States that settled in the Maritimes. The province, or the colony, I should say, established grammar schools at the turn of the 19th century for Anglophones. For Acadians, often because they had very few means, they tended to have traveling teachers. Sometimes they had French language classes and schools, but they tended to be rare. There weren't that many Acadians in New Brunswick at first. In 1801, there were only about 3,700. So it was a relatively small population. And even at the time of Confederation, they were maybe about 16 or 18% of the provincial population. But because of the high birth rate and the fact that the Catholic Church encouraged large families, the population kept on growing. And they were never the majority in New Brunswick. But since the second third of the 20th century, they have been a very significant minority. So a majority and often homogenous populations in the north and the east, and provincially counted for anywhere between 30 and 41% of the population, which means that in comparison to other Francophone minorities that have historically had between maybe 2 and 10% of the population, Acadian New Brunswickers have had political clout, and governments have been made and defeated in accordance to Acadian support, which isn't really the case for other Francophone minorities. There are certain seats, for example, where the Francophone population can be very important or a majority, but they are not as significant politically. They don't have that critical mass in order to influence things. And one of the defining characteristics or a proof of that political weight is the fact that they did have a schooling regulation that lasted about 5 years, but they were the first province actually to have a French language section within the Department of Education in 1884. So even though Acadians didn't have any constitutional rights in 1867 or particular constitutional rights, they did politically matter enough in order to begin developing French language institutions in the first years of Confederation.
Thank you for that. There seems to be a lot more nuance towards New Brunswick's French history than I think a lot of people give it credit for.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that New Brunswick at this time wouldn't strike me, or maybe I'm being unfair about it, but New Brunswick at this time doesn't strike me as a province that you would expect to be the hub of bilingualism or the champion of French language education. So my next question would be, how exactly does it become Canada's only official bilingual province? Because a lot of people know it as such, but don't really know exactly how that played out. How did that come about? How did that really actualize?
Yeah, so I think there are two reasons, really. There's that first issue of critical mass, where if you have numbers, if you have regions where you're a majority, you'll tend to be able to develop cultural institutions, the credit unions, cooperatives, higher education colleges, private institutions often. You'll be able to have an influence in school boards, even if you don't have linguistic boards in some areas. All the trustees are French language, are francophones, and therefore they can build schools or raise taxes, or they have more power because of that critical mass, at least regionally. Even if in Fredericton really took until the Louis Robichaud government in 1960 for Acadians to be numerous within cabinet. But they did have quite a bit of regional power, and the Catholic Church was an ally in the development of that institutional network. The other thing is that they did have the drive to develop a unique provincial regime, because Acadians have never forgotten that they were deported, or that they lost their lands in Nova Scotia. And that has tended to color the way that they see political engagement. They see this as a fight for the survival of their people. And, some have drawn parallels between, the situation of French Canadians and Acadians and Israel, for example, where the fact that the future of that people is never ensured, that it's always a struggle, that you're always going to need to be committed towards the development of political equality. And there are obviously a lot of differences, but there is that idea that we're unsure that we have a future that will exist in a few generations, and therefore we have to work towards developing institutions and rights. And Acadians have probably been the most aware of the need for that, because they have a historical example of how it can be taken away, right? So they established a lot of institutions that other Francophone minorities didn't necessarily have, or didn't have as many of. So even when we arrived at the middle of the 20th century, they had more Franco-Catholic colleges and colleges for girls. And they also sought to transform provincial political culture. Louis Robichaud's Liberals were elected in June 1960, 2 weeks before Jean Lesage was elected in Quebec. And there have been parallels that have been made between the Quiet Revolution and New Brunswick's Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, because Louis Robichaud didn't have an explicitly nationalist program. It was often through socioeconomic programs that sought to redistribute resources within the province and to further socioeconomic development amongst all New Brunswickers. But because Acadians tended to be the disadvantaged, well, they were probably those who benefited the most from those social policies. So when the province decided to build public high schools in areas that didn't have any, well, that disproportionately benefited Acadians who had fewer high schools. Same thing with the creation of a university in Moncton. Fredericton and St. John, and the Anglophones had a few universities in New Brunswick. Francophones had private Catholic colleges in the north. They did have Université Saint-Joseph, that was a religious university in Memramcook. But when they developed the University of Moncton, originally the idea was that it could be a bilingual university, but that it would be a regional one. It was sold as a regional university to Anglophones. Even if to Francophones, it was sold as your first public French language university. So again, it was a social measure in order for Moncton to have a university, but it ended up benefiting disproportionately Acadians, and therefore they were able to have to obtain actually the first and only public French language education created outside of Quebec in 1963. And with the centralization of education funding, well, it meant that the fact that, Anglophone pupils received, I think, 2.5 times more funding than Francophone ones. Well, with the Equal Opportunities Program, every pupil in the province would receive about the same amount of money for their education. So through social measures, Acadians could benefit from that, what we could call New Brunswick's Quiet Revolution. But it wasn't until the end of Robichaud's third mandate that he actually adopted the Provincial Official Languages Act. That's in April 1969, and that foresaw the advent of French language services and to promote the use of French within the provincial government within 8 years, because it was to come into effect between 1969 and 1977. But there were some provincial institutions that weren't concerned, that weren't included in the Provincial Official Languages Act, such as professional associations, health services, or municipalities. They were excluded in the first version of the Official Languages Act in the province. It was that law was adopted 3 months prior to the federal Official Languages Act that foresaw almost the same things in federal institutions.
So I find it interesting, the mix of communities, I guess, and the mix of, not requirements, but I guess the mix of expectations in terms of accessing education or accessing resources in your preferred language. And it's interesting, one of the things that you had shared in your notes, which I thought was quite nice, was the idea of New Brunswick as a province of dualism, or as a collective. You explained that New Brunswick wanted to adopt much more than token bilingualism, or else split into an Anglophone and then Acadian provinces within it. Can you explain how New Brunswick aimed not to tokenize bilingualism? So how they wanted to implement bilingualism in the province in a legitimate way that actually connected with the Franco population and resonated with the Francophones of the area?
The best point of comparison with New Brunswick would probably be Belgium, because you have linguistic populations that are territorially separated in large parts. You do have bilingual cities like Moncton and Grand Falls, for example, around between those zones. But you do have very Francophone territories to the north and the east, and very Anglophone regions to the south and the west, which means that people have thought about splitting up the province and actually making two provinces. And you could probably do it. It would bring about certain problems, but it was thought about as a solution to the difficulties in implementing bilingualism. The other thing that we need to take into account is that the Francophone population, especially in those homogenous areas, often did not speak English or spoke it very little, which meant that Francophones did not have access to provincial government services often. If they were centralized in Fredericton and you had only unilingual Anglophones working there, well, you had a good part of your residents that weren't receiving government services. We were in the territory of government inefficiency in a certain way and of discrimination, because you had people paying taxes that couldn't receive government services. And especially with the expansion of the welfare state after World War II, the role that the provincial government played in the lives of people was growing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So the Liberal Party adapted to this philosophy that this was a social issue. The progressive conservative government of Richard Hatfield that was in power from 1970 to 1987 took it a step further in recognizing the existence of distinct communities, linguistic communities. They did not want to recognize Acadians as a people, because then there was the issue of self-determination that would come into effect. So some Acadian militants wanted to go towards there to kind of create a province within a province, or to decentralize government so that there would be two kind of different units of the provincial government. The Hatfield government did accept to do this in education, to kind of have a separate office for French language education. And they did do other measures such as French language school boards that we talked about in episode 3, the creation of the first French language common law school outside Quebec in 1978. And they also brought about the act recognizing the equality of two official linguistic communities in 1981. It was also known as Bill 88, that kind of said the province is indivisible, but we recognize that that New-Brunswickers should have rights as individuals, but also as equal communities, and therefore introduced a second point of reference from which you could measure equality. So it wasn't only social and individual like it was under the Robichaud government in the 1960s. It was also collective. So you needed to look at substantive equality. It wasn't the terms that were used at that time, but that was the idea behind Bill 88. Is that if linguistic assimilation, for example, existed or took off for one group or another, it was a reflection of a larger linguistic power struggle. And therefore, it was the responsibility of the provincial government to ensure to keep linguistic transfers at a minimum, and that if it was at a reasonable rate, that it would be reflecting policies that were equitable towards Francophones and Anglophones. So that was probably the most, no other official language community in Canada has that type of recognition. The federal government has recognized Quebec as a nation in 2006, but that didn't really come with any constitutional recognition, whereas Bill 88 in 1993 was included in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So the Official Languages Act was included in the original charter in 1982, and then Bill 88 was also added to the charter in 1993. So it's the only Francophone community that is constitutionally recognized, that has constitutional rights beyond schooling. So when we say it's a dualist regime, it is distinct from the type of bilingualism that's practiced by the federal government or the provincial governments of Ontario and Quebec, for example, that have each their own model, but it's definitely more centered on individual rights or individual services, in opposition to New Brunswick, where duality needs to be reflected pretty much in every aspect of provincial government services.
You would hope that some of those areas that you're talking about that result in the actualization of bilingualism, you kind of hope that some of those points that you mentioned would have been realized by the other provinces as well. So it's kind of interesting that nobody took a page out of New Brunswick's book and went, that actually worked quite well. Maybe we'll try that here. But change in progress is slow. So we've explored the historical lead up and the actualization of genuine official, in air quotes, bilingualism in New Brunswick. But when looking at the province today and with a modern lens, is New Brunswick still in the progress of securing the rights for French language use in French communities? Is it still a constant and ongoing battle that needs to be fought? Or are these rights for Francophones now secured in New Brunswick and the battle is over and we can just be happy and bilingual and dual?
It's continued to develop for sure. I mean, the one of the case, the Charlebois case at the Provincial Court of Appeal in 2001 had kind of challenged the fact that municipalities were excluded from the Official Languages Act, and that with the fact that Bill 88 was now constitutional since 1993, that the fact that you had a city like Moncton that wasn't officially bilingual, that was probably unconstitutional. So the Court of Appeal actually required 19 municipalities to have their bylaws translated and pushed the province strongly to revisit the Official Languages Act, which it did the following year. Moncton did become an official bilingual city in 2002, and the Official Languages Act was rewritten in June 2002. So it reaffirmed the right to use the official language of one's choice without the aid of an interpreter in provincial and municipal courts, which isn't a right that exists in other provinces. That all municipalities with an official language minority population of at least 20% to adopt and publish their bylaws in both official languages, which means that in New Brunswick today, you do have municipalities that are officially French, others that are officially English, and you have a significant number, I don't have it right now, but it's within the dozens of municipalities that are officially bilingual. They also established the position of the Commissioner of Official Languages, who is an ombudsperson whose role is to oversee bilingualism in the administration and municipalities that are designated. The other two items that we could mention are the fact that the federal institutions, such as the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which serves as the provincial police in New Brunswick, is also bound by the requirements of the Official Languages Act and Bill 88, which means that it is required to offer services in both official languages more than in any other province, because it is bound by the provincial laws for our duality. So we've talked about in Quebec the fact that federal institutions could maybe follow the charter of the French language. In this case, the Supreme Court of Canada said that federal institutions have to provide or have to reach the bilingual thresholds of the provincial laws, which tend to be higher than those of the federal government. And finally, the Acadians were able to have a French language health authority. They did have regional health authorities in New Brunswick. Some were French, some were bilingual, and some were Anglophone. The Liberal government of Sean Graham wanted to merge those with one bilingual and one Anglophone. And then you had a situation where the Supreme Court Justice Michel Bastarache actually resigned from the Supreme Court to sue his provincial government to say that they were not respecting the spirit of Bill 88, and he won, which meant that they created two health authorities in the province, one that would be working in French and offer frontline services in both official languages, and a mirror health authority, one that would work in English for the south and the west of the province, and that would offer frontline French language services. Also, and it's the only province that has a French language authority that manages public funds, community health centers, hospitals, and on a board that's at least half of it is democratically elected. And that's a unique situation that doesn't exist elsewhere in Canada. So you have duality that exists also in health institutions, in addition to education. So it's definitely the most developed regime of duality in the country. Militants have hoped to continue developing it. They've had a hard time under the government of Blaine Higgs that has tried to restructure a variety of things that has tended to centralize certain powers that had been awarded to school boards, for example. So school boards continue to exist, but they have less authority and power than they used to. Funding for French language education and French immersion has also been moved around and and there have been plans to restructure it that haven't completely worked because there's been a lot of resistance. But some see the current government as the current government that includes elements from the former Confederation of Regions party that was quite hostile to duality and bilingualism, and that formed the official opposition from 1987 to 1991. Some elements are actually within the Progressive Conservative Party now, and therefore that party is no longer in a logic of development, duality, but rather in a logic of restructuring and returning maybe to a certain era where Anglophones held the purse strings and the power in Fredericton. So certain elements are under threat, even if there hasn't been the large restructuration of a lot of these political gains since 2018. But we've definitely stopped developing this regime since the Health Authority was developed in 2010, 2011.
So from all that, I guess the battle for bilingualism continues in one of Canada's oldest provinces.
Yeah, when you're a minority, I think the struggle always exists. It'll never disappear completely, but yeah, it can be easier and harder in accordance to the political context, for sure.
We're definitely seeing a lot of boomeranging in terms of political parties that operate, and a bit nervous for the years to come, but much like New Brunswick, I'm sure we'll bounce back, and hopefully the Francophone community will continue to fight strong as they always have.
Yes, and one of its successes too is the fact that the assimilation rate is much lower in Brunswick than it is in other Francophone communities. We're today around 12 or 15%, which is historically high, but it's nowhere near the 45% in Ontario and 70% in British Columbia, for example. So it continues to be a story of success on that front. Some of it is due to legislation and political structures. Some of it is also due to critical mass and territorial concentration. And that continues to support the existence of linguistic duality and the existence of two linguistic communities within New Brunswick that continues to be more equitable than other arrangements that are available within Canada.
I'm sure we could go on to a whole other episode talking about those other arrangements in Canada.
Yes.
But with that, we'll wrap it up now. I would like to thank our listeners for joining us in this podcast to learn about the history of bilingualism in Canada, and for this episode specifically to learn about dual bilingualism in New Brunswick. I would also like to thank Serge for sharing his wealth of knowledge with us as we explored Regulation 17, the fight for French language high schools and French school management, and now bilingualism in New Brunswick. If you would like to listen to these episodes again or discover more historical and educational content in the DMC project on 250 years of bilingualism in Canada, visit us at www.definingmomentscanada.ca. Thank you and goodbye.
As always, thank you, Anna and Serge, for this discussion on the duality of New Brunswick. If you found this episode interesting, listen to other episodes of this podcast series dealing with subjects such as Regulation 17 or the battle for French language secondary schools in Ontario. You can always check out the partner resources that have been created and all other resources of the Unique Bilingual State Project on the Defining Moments Canada website.